A woman pushing a single piece of paper across a conference table without reading it. That action looks like surrender. It is not surrender. You're watching Eternal Diary. The morning I came back, the first thing I felt was carpet. Not the cold tile of a hospital floor, not the weighted nothing of the ending I'd been moving toward for 7 years. Carpet, thick and slightly damp from the humidifier Adrian kept running even in July, because Delphine had told him once that dry air was bad for the skin, and he had adopted that opinion as his own, the way he adopted all of her opinions, which was immediately and without attribution. I lay still for a moment, face down, cataloging what I knew. I was 31 years old. It was a Tuesday in early March. The humidifier wheezed in the corner of the bedroom. Downstairs, Adrian was making coffee in the French press he'd brought back from Delphine's vacation to Portugal, a gift she'd picked up for him. Yes, which he'd described to me as something she'd picked up for the house, as though houses required French presses, and that detail would clarify things. I knew this because I had lived through this Tuesday before. I also knew that 7 years from now, I would die in a parking garage in a city I'd never intended to live in, with $42 in a checking account that wasn't in my name, while Adrian stood in front of federal investigators and explained, in the careful voice he used for careful situations, that his ex-wife had handled all the household finances. It wasn't the dying that stayed with me, it was the filing. We had filed taxes jointly for 6 years. Adrian prepared the returns, or rather, his accountant prepared them. A man named Proctor, who I had met exactly twice, and who communicated through a single annual email containing a PDF, a brief summary paragraph, and the instruction to sign page 4, 5, and the signature line on the K1, if applicable. I had signed every return without reading the documents. Not because I was careless. Because Adrian had said early in our marriage and many times after that Proctor handled everything, and I had understood handled everything to mean that everything was handled, which was a misunderstanding that would, in my first life, cost me the ability to afford a winter coat in December. The firm was called Caldwell Solutions. Adrian had built it over the years before we married. A consulting practice in operations and logistics, solid and slightly dull from the outside, which was the point. Inside, I.O.'s Caldwell had been running a parallel set of books since before I'd ever heard of it. Income routed through shell entities registered in Delaware and Nevada, contractors paid cash, no 10-9s filed. A property renovation expensed as a business loss on a building he'd told me belonged to his mother. By the time the IRS came, there was a 7-year audit trail and $214,000 in unreported income, and my signature was on every return that contained it. I had learned what joint and several liability meant from a tax attorney I could not afford, standing in her office on a December afternoon with my coat open because the building was warm, and I could not make myself do a button without knowing how many of my remaining buttons were worth doing. A joint and several liability means that when a married couple files a joint return, both spouses are fully responsible for the entire tax debt. Not 50% each. All of it. The IRS does not divide blame between parties the way a divorce court divides assets. They identify who has something to take, and they take it. Adrian had spent years protecting his assets in ways I hadn't known to watch for. I had nothing to protect and had protected nothing. In my second life, I understood that I had approximately 7 years before the audit came, and I intended to use every one of them. I got up off the carpet, I went to the bathroom and ran the cold tap and stood at the sink with the water on my wrists until the strange vertigo of return settled. Then I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. 31. Dark circles, but manageable ones. My hair was longer than I'd remembered. I looked like someone who still believed in the face she was looking at, which was useful because I was going to need to keep looking exactly like that for several years. I went downstairs. Adrian was at the kitchen island with his phone face down, always face down, and the French press steeping beside him. He looked the same. He always looked the same. Broad shoulders, strong jaw, that slightly distant expression he cultivated to suggest that his thoughts were occupying a more important altitude than whatever room he was standing in. I had once found this attractive. The residue of that was still in my chest, which I found annoying. I had expected to return with nothing but clarity. What I had instead was clarity sitting on top of something that still remembered what it had felt like to love him, and that would take longer to dissolve than the strategy would take to build. I poured myself coffee. I stood at the counter. I watched him scroll. The first thing I needed was to understand the exact contours of the plan I was going to execute, not the emotional plan. Leave him, start over, protect yourself. That part was simple. The legal and financial architecture was what required precision. There is a specific protection available to spouses who file joint tax returns and can later demonstrate that they did not know and had no reason to know that the return they signed contained a tax understatement. It is called innocent spouse relief, and it exists under Internal Revenue Code Section 6015. There are 3 variants: basic relief under 6015B, separation of liability under 6015C, and equitable relief under 6015F. Each has its own criteria, but the central requirement across all 3 is the same. The spouse seeking relief must demonstrate that at the time of signing, they had no knowledge of and no reason to know about the understatement. No reason to know. In my first life, I had known nothing. I simply hadn't documented my not knowing. I had signed, filed, moved through my days, and left no contemporaneous record of the conditions under which I'd signed. When investigators asked why I hadn't questioned certain entries on the return, I had nothing to offer except the fact of my own incuriosity, which did not translate well into a legal defense. In this life, I was going to build a record of my not knowing from the first month. This is harder to explain than it sounds. You cannot fabricate ignorance after the fact. The IRS is not looking for someone who claims not to have known. They are looking for a consistent pattern of behavior, established over time, in the ordinary course of a marriage, that is structurally inconsistent with having known. The record has to predate any suspicion. It has to be the ordinary documentation of a spouse who was trying in good faith to understand something she was being kept out of, not the strategic documentation of a woman building a legal case. The difference between those 2 things is in the tone, the timing, and the texture of what you produce. I had spent a great deal of my second life's first morning thinking about that difference. "Oh, morning," Adrian said, not looking up from his phone. "Morning," I said. I poured my coffee. I said I was going to the gym. He said, I drove to the gym, parked in the lot, and sat in the car with my phone for 40 minutes. I found a credit union 12 miles from our house, in a direction Adrian had no reason to travel, connected to none of the institutions Proctor had ever mentioned in his annual emails. I opened a savings account and a checking account online. I used my maiden name, which was still my legal name. I had never changed it. A practical decision I'd made early in the marriage because I had a freelance client base built under that name, and which now felt, in the parking lot with the engine off and the morning still pale, like the first decision I hadn't made wrong. Well, I funded the accounts with a small transfer from my personal savings. Enough to establish history, small enough to attract no questions. Then I sat there for a moment and let myself feel how strange the whole thing was. I was 31 years old. I was building a legal defense against a tax fraud case that hadn't happened yet. I was doing it in a gym parking lot at 7:45 in the morning, while my husband drank French press coffee at a kitchen island and his phone stayed face down because Delphine might text before 9. It felt less like power than like maintenance, like cleaning out a gutter before a rain that wasn't forecast yet. I drove home. I made a second pot of coffee. I asked Adrian how his week looked. He said Caldwell had a new client in the energy sector. He said Proctor had mentioned something about quarterly estimates and he'd handle it. He said it like all the things he said about Proctor, in the register of a man reporting weather. Distant, informational, no entry point for me. Of course, I said. I trust you. I meant it as documentation, delivered to a man who heard it as a domestic pleasantry. That was fine. The meaning wasn't for him. The weeks that followed had a particular texture that I worked to maintain. I went to work, I took client projects, I deposited every dollar of my income into the credit union accounts. I kept a simple private spreadsheet on a laptop that lived in my studio, connected to a cloud storage account that shared no domain with our household accounts, recording every dollar I earned, where it came from, and where it went. I also began to do something I had never done in my first life, which was read the documents that arrived in my name. Not all documents. Not in a way that would look like sudden vigilance, or worse, suspicion. Just the ordinary financial correspondence of a married woman who was making a small, quiet effort to understand her own household. The joint checking statements, the credit card bills, the annual tax return that Proctor emailed in April, a PDF with a brief cover note that always began, "Dear Adrian and Vesper, please find attached your completed federal and state returns for the prior tax year," followed by instructions on where to sign and where to return. In my first life, I had opened that email, skimmed the cover note, and signed wherever indicated, the way you sign a delivery receipt. As a formality, not a decision. Hot in this life, I printed the return and read every line. I looked up definitions, I noted line items I didn't understand, and then I wrote an email to Adrian. Not an accusation. A question. Several of them. Phrased in the genuine voice of a person trying to be a better financial partner. I noticed that Schedule C shows income from subcontractors. Is that typical for the kind of consulting work Caldwell does? There's a home office deduction listed here. I work from home sometimes too. Should I be tracking my own home office use separately for my freelance income? I'm seeing a K-1 form I don't recognize. Is this from a partnership Caldwell is in? Adrian answered all of these questions the same way, with slight variations of phrasing across the years. Proctor handles all of that. It's complicated. You don't need to worry about it. Just sign where I've marked. Those answers were not incriminating, but they were, in writing, a record that I had asked, and a record that I had been told explicitly not to pursue the asking further. That record was the spine of what I was building. I asked similar questions each year. Not identical. The IRS would notice a pattern that was too precise, too consistent in its framing. I varied the questions slightly, came at them from different angles, asked some years through email and some years in texts that I screenshot and archived. The underlying message was always the same. She was trying to understand, and she was being directed away from understanding. In the second year, a woman named Josephine noticed. Josephine and I had been friends since we were 22. She had spent nearly a decade as a paralegal at a family law firm, then transitioned to independent legal research and notary work, which had given her a knowledge of legal structures that was broad and practical and entirely unromantic. She had also developed, over those years, a specific way of watching people, a stillness in conversation that meant she was processing more than she acknowledged. We were at lunch in February of that second year, a restaurant with bread that was always too good, and wine that was served without pretension. I was telling her, carefully, not everything, about the pattern of Adrian's financial redirection, about the questions I'd asked and the way they'd been deflected. She put down her fork and looked at me. "Why are you logging those emails?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was an identification. I looked at my plate. "I'm organized," I said. "Vesper." I looked up. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "But I want you to know that if a person ever needed to demonstrate a genuine lack of access to financial information, the best corroboration isn't her own emails. It's an independent professional who reviewed the relevant documents and can attest to what was and wasn't visible to a non-specialist." I looked at her. "Someone who wouldn't work for her husband," she said. "Someone who would have their own independent record." She picked up her fork. "I'm just noting that," she said. I thought about it for a week. Then I looked for an enrolled agent. An enrolled agent is a tax professional licensed directly by the IRS, not a CPA, not a tax preparer, but someone who can represent taxpayers before the IRS, and who, by the nature of their credential, though has a working knowledge of examination procedures and audit triggers. I found one named Marcus, who had an office near my studio, in a part of the city that Adrian had no particular reason to visit. He was methodical and slightly reserved, which I found reassuring. He was not Proctor's kind of accountant, not someone who worked in the grammar of minimal disclosure and maximum optimization. He worked in the grammar of accuracy, which was the only grammar I needed. I hired Marcus not to prepare our returns. Proctor still did that, but to review them. Every spring, I brought Marcus the completed return that Proctor had prepared, and I asked him to walk me through it in plain language, as though I were someone who genuinely wanted to understand what I'd signed, because I was. I needed my confusion to be authentic, and it was. Almost what Marcus found, across 5 years of review, were returns that were technically coherent. No obvious errors, no sloppy arithmetic, but that contained entries he consistently described, in his careful written summaries, as aggressive. The subcontractor payments on Schedule C, aggressive, because the amounts were large and the corresponding service descriptions were vague. A home office deduction that exceeded proportional square footage. Aggressive, because the square footage claim was not supported by any documentation Marcus could identify. A business meal expense total that seemed high relative to the reported revenue. Aggressive, because the IRS scrutinizes that ratio. Marcus documented his findings in writing every year. Each letter was addressed to me, paid for from my credit union account. And filed by me in a physical folder in a locked drawer in my studio. I also scanned each letter and uploaded it to the private cloud account that had no connection to any of Adrian's digital infrastructure. The letters were not accusations of fraud. Marcus was an enrolled agent reviewing a client's tax return, not an investigator. His job was to flag items that might attract scrutiny, and that is what he did. But the flags were there, documented in dated professional correspondence, in a file that existed entirely outside of Adrian's world. In the third year, Marcus found something I had not expected. "This entity," he said, setting his finger on a line in the partnership schedule. "Meridian Consulting Group, LLC. Do you recognize it?" I told him I didn't. He turned the page. "It appears as a pass-through loss on the Quan. So the loss allocated to your return is $83,000, which offsets income from Caldwell Solutions. The effect is to substantially reduce taxable income for the year." He paused. "I've done some public records research. Meridian has a registered agent in Nevada. It's been active as a legal entity for approximately 2 years. But I can find no evidence of commercial activity, no clients, no revenue-generating contracts, no visible business footprint. Is that legal?" "The existence of an entity without visible activity is not itself illegal," he said carefully. "Entities can operate with private contracts, private clients, but losses without corresponding revenue from a demonstrated business purpose are one of the primary triggers for examination. If the IRS decides to look at the returns, to Meridian is where they'll look first." He put his summary in writing as usual. I filed it with the others. I did not tell Adrian what Marcus had found. I did not ask him about Meridian. I signed the return that year as I had signed every year, on the pages Proctor had marked, without visible hesitation. This is the part that confuses people when I explain it. Why keep signing? Why not refuse or demand answers or file separately? The answer is in the relief statute itself. Innocent spouse relief under Section 6015(b) is only available to a spouse who signed a joint return. If I had refused to sign and filed separately, I would have eliminated my joint and several liability going forward, but I also would have tipped Adrian to my suspicions, giving him time to restructure Caldwell and Meridian in ways that might have insulated him while complicating my own position, in ways I couldn't fully predict. And I would have lost the relief entirely because the statute requires a signed joint return. You cannot claim innocent spouse status on a separate filing. There is no such thing. The protection exists because of the joint return. The joint return is the price of the protection. I signed because signing, combined with everything I was building around the signature, was the correct legal move. The signature was not submission. It was the instrument. I want to be exact about one more thing from those years. I never fabricated anything. Not an email, not a letter, not a record of any kind. Everything I documented was accurate and contemporaneous. Produced at the time it occurred, also in the ordinary course of events, before there was any formal reason to produce it. The questions I asked Adrian were genuine questions. The confusion I expressed to Marcus was genuine confusion. I was not pretending to be uninvolved in Adrian's finances. I was genuinely uninvolved, and I was making a record that reflected that genuinely. The strategy was not to deceive anyone. It was to make sure the truth was legible when someone eventually needed to read it. Adrian, during those years, remained essentially himself. He traveled for Caldwell with the frequency of a man who needed reasons to be elsewhere. He had a phone he kept face down on all surfaces, which had once felt like a small wound to notice and now felt like a structural convenience. It meant he was not attending to mine. He cooked elaborate weekend dinners and was generous and distracted and occasionally very charming, the way people are charming when they are aware that charming is being required of them. Delphine materialized at a Caldwell client event in the autumn of the third year. She worked in financial advisory. She had the kind of carefully maintained beauty that announces itself as natural through the considerable effort of appearing to be so. And she looked at Adrian across a catered room with the expression of someone examining a thing they have already decided to acquire and are now confirming their own good judgment about. I noticed. I noticed him notice her noticing. I said nothing, did nothing, slow, and experienced a feeling that was less like jealousy and more like recognition. The particular cold clarity of watching something begin that you already know the ending of. That evening, when we got home, I photographed the event program, which listed the attendees and their organizational affiliations. I added it to my file. Not because Delphine would be legally relevant to the tax case, she wouldn't. But I was learning in those years that documentation is not a targeted response to specific threats. It is a practice. You build the record comprehensively, and when the time comes, you find that the thing you need is already there, already dated, already legible to someone other than yourself. Delphine and Adrian began their arrangement sometime in the 4th year, so I knew this the way I had known it in my first life. Through the small behavioral shifts of a man who is dividing his attention, the particular quality of distraction that comes from managing something you believe no one can see, the explanations that didn't quite close, the trip to London that was supposed to be 3 days and became 4 without a clear reason, the way he answered questions about his schedule with the slight half-second delay of someone retrieving a prepared answer rather than remembering an actual event. In my first life, I had found this devastating. I had asked, confronted, waited, forgiven, waited again. I had made myself very small in the space of our marriage and then been surprised when it didn't save me. In this life, I found it useful. Because Adrian's preoccupation with Delphine meant he was paying less attention to what I was doing. And what I was doing, across the 4th and 5th years, was methodically relocating my financial center of gravity. My graphic design income had grown. I had 3 anchor clients, including a retainer arrangement with a mid-sized brand consultancy that paid consistently and reliably. I had raised my rates twice and kept all of my client relationships in the single domain of my own professional reputation, entirely uncrossed with anything Adrian had built or anyone Adrian knew. All of my income went to the credit union accounts, with the regularity and visible source clarity that would later, when an examiner looked at my financial records, appear as exactly what it was. The clean, separate earnings of a person who had been living a financial life that had nothing to do with the entity under examination. I opened a Roth IRA in the 2nd year. The annual contributions were modest, the investment allocation was simple, and I left it alone, which is the correct strategy for a Roth IRA, and also, incidentally, the best way to demonstrate that the account was never being used as a vehicle for anything other than ordinary retirement savings. Unremarkable accounts, maintained consistently over years, are a form of testimony. They say this person was doing the boring, normal thing regularly, with no particular urgency, which is the behavioral profile of someone who had no reason to panic. In the 5th year, I sat down with a family law attorney. Not to file for divorce? Not yet. I needed to understand the terrain I would eventually be walking through. She was a woman who wore her reading glasses halfway down her nose and looked at clients over them with the expression of someone who has heard many situations described as unique. I laid out my position for her. The separate accounts, the retainer income, the Roth IRA, the way our joint account was funded. I deposited a fixed monthly sum to cover my share of household expenses and nothing more. What I want to understand, I told her, is whether this creates a defensible separate property position. She looked at me over her glasses. Yes, she said. In a common law state, separately titled accounts funded exclusively with separate income and never commingled with marital assets retain their separate character. Oh, you've maintained that quite carefully. Good, I said. She looked at me for another moment. Why are you here now, if you're not ready to file? Because I want to know what I'm walking into before I walk into it, I said. She nodded. She did not ask further questions. She billed me for the hour, which I paid from my private account, and I filed her card in the locked drawer alongside Marcus's letters. I want to tell you about that drawer. It was a standard filing drawer in a secondhand desk I'd bought when I set up my studio, the kind of drawer that locks with a small key that I kept on my regular keyring, indistinguishable from the others. Inside the drawer there were 5 folders, each labeled with a year. Each folder contained Marcus's annual review letter, my copies of the federal and state returns for that year, printed screenshots of the email exchange with Adrian in which he directed me to sign without asking questions, and a one-page note in my own handwriting summarizing what I had and hadn't known about Caldwell's finances as of January of that tax year. Those handwritten notes were important, not as evidence in themselves. They were self-serving documents, created by me, but as anchors to the contemporaneous record. They were dated. They were consistent with everything else in the file. They reflected a person trying, year by year, to understand something she was being kept out of. The drawer also contained a USB drive with copies of everything, and the USB drive lived in a second location, a small fireproof box at Josephine's apartment, which I had asked her to store without explanation and which she had accepted without asking for one. Adrian told me about Delphine on a Thursday evening in November of the 5th year. He came home late and sat on the edge of the bed, and his posture had the particular compressed quality of a person who has rehearsed something and is now performing it with the awareness that performance and feeling are not quite the same thing. He told me it had been going on for about a year, which was wrong by 12 months, but I didn't correct him. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted to figure out what to do. He said this in the tone of a man who wanted figuring out what to do to take a long time. I looked at him. "Okay," I said. He seemed surprised. He had anticipated a scene. Accusations, tears, the particular grammar of a confrontation that would, in his reading of it, eventually permit reconciliation on terms he could manage. Well, he was a man who needed emotional volatility in others to feel that his own composure was a virtue. "I need some time to think," I said. "We can talk about it this weekend." "Okay," he said. He went to the guest room. I lay in the dark for an hour and let myself understand where I actually was. The file was complete through year 5. The Roth IRA had 5 years of consistent contributions. The credit union accounts had 5 years of clean, traceable income. My client list was solid. My professional reputation existed entirely independently of anything with Adrian's name on it. What remained was the timing. The weekend came, we talked. Adrian wanted to try to work through things, which was his way of saying he wanted nothing to change while he decided between his options. He was a man who had learned to treat unresolved situations as a form of flexibility. As long as nothing was decided, he retained all possibilities. I told him I wanted to separate. He looked relieved, then slightly deflated by the calm of it. He had needed my anger to organize his own feelings around. Without it, he seemed slightly at a loss. We agreed on a separation. 3 weeks later, I moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in a building that was solid and unremarkable and had nothing to do with any part of Adrian's life. I paid the deposit and first month from my credit union account. I notified my clients. I opened a dedicated business bank account, also in my name only, funded exclusively with client income. I informed Marcus of the separation. He wrote back the following day. "Noted. I have updated the file accordingly. I'm available should you require any additional review work. I updated my records. I did not file for divorce. Not yet." The separation itself and its documentation was part of the timeline my attorney had walked me through, and I intended to follow that timeline exactly. 6 months after I moved out, Adrian called. He was calm in the manner of a man who had been told by his attorney to be calm, which is a specific and slightly exhausting kind of calm. He said he had received IRS correspondence. He said it appeared to be a notice of examination. He said Proctor believed it was probably routine. I asked which years were covered. He told me, years 2 through 6 of our marriage. Every year Marcus had reviewed a return and flagged something and written it up in a careful letter that was now sitting in a locked drawer and on a USB drive in Josephine's fireproof box. "Is this about Caldwell?" I said. "Proctor says it's routine," he repeated. "You should retain a tax controversy attorney," I said. "Not just Proctor." "You signed those returns too," he said. His voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it that was testing the structure of the calm from below. "I did," I said. "I also kept entirely separate finances and had no involvement in Caldwell's operations. I assume that will be visible when they look at my records." A pause. "You should still participate in the examination," he said. "It will look better if we're coordinated." "I'll have my own representation," I said. Oh, they can coordinate through our respective attorneys. I ended the call. I sat in my kitchen for a moment. Then I called Marcus. And the following morning, I called a tax controversy attorney whose name had been in my file for 2 years, held in reserve against precisely this use. Her name was Dr. Hadley. She had spent a decade at the IRS before moving to private practice, which meant she understood the examination process the way a former resident understands a hospital, not as an outsider navigating a system, but as someone who knew where the rooms were, how the paperwork moved, what the language in a particular type of notice actually meant, and what it implied. I spent an hour on the phone with her. I explained my situation completely. The 6 years of returns, the separate financial history, the Marcus letters, the email documentation of Adrian's redirection, the Meridian entity that Marcus had flagged in year 3. I explained all of it in order, in plain language, without editorializing. She was quiet through most of it. When I finished, she said, "You've built an unusually complete contemporaneous record for a non-attorney." "I had reasons," I said. "I can see that." A pause. "Tell me about the enrolled agent. Tell me exactly what his letters say." I told her about Marcus's letters in detail, the language he used for aggressive entries, the specific items he flagged each year, the fact that each letter was produced in the ordinary course of an annual review I'd hired him to do and paid for from my separate account, with no connection to any audit or investigation that had not yet existed when the letters were written. "Oh, 5 letters," she said. 5 years, I said. Dated, professionally letterheaded, paid from a demonstrably separate account. "Yes." Another pause. "And the emails where he directs you not to pursue inquiry." 3 years of email. After year 3, he stopped using email for those responses. I paused. I noted the change. "You noted the change? How?" "A contemporaneous, handwritten note in my annual file, dated the month he switched to verbal redirections only." She was quiet again. Then she said, "There's one specific email I want to see before we discuss strategy." I knew which one she meant. "Just sign where I've marked," I said. "Yes." "I have it." "Forward it today." I did, from a dedicated email address I had created for legal correspondence and used for nothing else. She called me back within the hour. "That email," she said, "is direct written evidence of exclusion from the content of the filing. It's the clearest single piece of documentation I've seen in a case of this type." "I thought it might be," I said. We scheduled an in-person meeting for the following week. In the meantime, she asked me to compile the complete file, physical and digital, and have it ready. I had been ready for 2 years. I want to describe the meeting because it was the first time I had sat in a room where someone else knew the complete shape of what I had built, and that was a different feeling than holding it alone. Dr. Hadley's office was in a building that smelled of recycled air and had windows that let in thin afternoon light. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent years reading what people don't say. She went through the file methodically, without comment, turning pages with the deliberate pace of someone who was not rushing to judgment and did not intend to. When she finished, she set the file down and looked at me. "The examination will almost certainly be driven by Meridian," she said. "The law structure is consistent with a paper entity designed to absorb income and reduce taxable liability without corresponding business activity. The IRS has been scrutinizing these structures for several years. Proctor will argue Meridian had legitimate business purpose. He won't prevail." "I know," I said. "The question for you is the innocent spouse filing. We're going to file Form 8857 under Section 6015B as soon as the examination notice is formal. The core test is whether you knew or had reason to know of the understatement." She looked down at the file. "The record establishes, in documentary detail, that you were excluded from the financial operations underlying the deficiency, that you attempted to understand the returns you were signing and were redirected, that you engaged independent professional review of those returns, and documented concerns about specific entries, and that your own financial life was kept entirely separate from Caldwell's and Meridian's activities." She looked back up. "It is a strong case," she said. "The email is the capstone, but the entire record is coherent and consistent." "What's the timeline?" I said. The 8857 process takes 12 to 24 months in most cases. Between filing and determination, the examination on Adrian's side will proceed, but his representative will have the opportunity to provide information that could complicate your application. For example, arguing that you benefited from the underreported income in a meaningful way. I didn't, I said. My income was entirely separate. Our household expenses were split. The joint account was funded by fixed contributions from each of us. I know, she said. The financial record makes that clear. She paused. Vesper, I want to tell you one more thing directly. Go ahead. The scope of underreporting, combined with the structure of Meridian, puts this case in a category where criminal referral to the Department of Justice is a realistic possibility. The IRS can refer willful tax evasion to federal prosecutors. I sat with that. That would be Adrian's exposure to manage, I said. Yes, she said. Well, not yours. No, I said. Not mine. The examination began in spring. It moved in the way all large formal processes move. Slowly, procedurally, with a rhythm that bore no relationship to the emotional weight of what it was determining. The IRS assigned an examining agent who communicated with Dr. Hadley through formal written channels. Adrian's representative was, as I'd expected, not Proctor. He had engaged a litigation-focused tax attorney named Ferris, who had a reputation in Dr. Hadley's professional circle for being technically skilled and slightly prone to overconfidence when the documentary record was running against him. The documentary record was running against him. The examiners identified unreported income across 5 tax years of $231,000, out distributed between Caldwell's direct operations and Meridian's pass-through structure. The penalties for failure to report, combined with interest on the outstanding liability, brought the total assessed deficiency to $342,000. I heard that number for the first time in Dr. Hadley's office on a Tuesday morning, and she said it the way she said all numbers, with the flat evenness of a professional delivering facts, as though the magnitude was relevant, but not exceptional. Joint and several, I said. Yes, which is why the 8857 goes out today. Form 8857 is a detailed document. It asks you to describe, in specific and verifiable terms, your level of involvement in the preparation of the joint returns at issue. Well, because it asks you to describe your knowledge of the business activities that gave rise to the understatement. It asks you to explain your financial circumstances, your access to financial information, your professional background, and any circumstances that would make it inequitable to hold you liable for a deficiency you did not create. I had been preparing to complete that form for 6 years. Dr. Hadley had drafted it based on my file. It was 12 pages. I read all 12 pages in her office, sitting across from her desk, taking approximately 40 minutes. She did not rush me. What I was reading was a precise, documented account of what I had actually lived. The emails in which I asked questions and was told the matter was handled. The Marcus letters, each flagging specific items, and noting that the returns were prepared by a third-party accountant, and that the client had expressed genuine unfamiliarity with certain entries. The separate financial history, clean and traceable, demonstrating that my earnings had never been channeled through Caldwell, never been commingled with the income streams now under examination, never been part of the financial operations that had generated the liability. The email at the center of it, 5 words long, which Adrian had sent me in April of the 3rd year of our marriage. Just sign where I've marked. I signed the Form 8857 and handed it back. Dr. Hadley filed it that afternoon. Adrian called me twice in the months that followed. The first call, in late summer, had the bright compression of managed panic. He said Ferris was optimistic. He said Proctor had documentation of Meridian's business purpose. He said he hoped we could navigate this together. I told him that all communications should go through Dr. Hadley and Ferris respectively, and I ended the call. The second call came in October. Flatter, the brightness was gone. He had learned something, or Ferris had finally told him something he had been hoping not to hear. They're considering criminal referral, he said. I know, I said. Vesper? A pause. If you cooperate with them against me... Adrian, I said, I am not cooperating against anyone. I am demonstrating that I am not liable for a deficiency I did not create. That is the complete scope of my involvement." "You signed those returns," he said, and his voice had found the ghost of an accusation somewhere beneath the flatness. "I did," I said. "You prepared them. Or Proctor did, on your instructions, without my knowledge or access." I heard him breathe. "Just sign where I've marked," I said. "Do you remember that?" The line held silence for a moment. "Those were your words," I said. "In writing." The call ended. I stood at the window of my apartment and looked at the street below, where a woman was walking a very small dog that appeared to be arguing with the leash, and I felt the specific, quiet, accurate feeling of standing in a place where the math was right. Not satisfaction, not victory, not the relief of something finally over. Just the unadorned clarity of a situation that had resolved in the direction it had always been going to resolve because I had understood the direction and had not stood in its way. It showed the IRS issued its preliminary determination letter 11 months after the Form 8857 was filed. I was granted innocent spouse relief under Internal Revenue Code, Section 6015. B. The determination letter noted that the evidence established a consistent pattern of exclusion from financial decision-making, that the applicant had engaged independent professional review of returns she was required to sign without access to the underlying business records, and that direct written communications demonstrated the applicant had been explicitly directed not to pursue further inquiry into specific line items. The letter further noted that the applicant's financial history demonstrated no commingling with the assets and income streams giving rise to the deficiency, and no benefit derived from the underreported income that was not also available from the applicant's own independently documented earnings. $342,000 in joint and several liability. None of it mine. Dr. Hadley called when the letter came. Her voice was the same as it always was. Precise, professionally warm, giving nothing to the dramatic. "It's a full grant," she said. "Clean, no partial determination, no conditions. Full relief." "Good," I said. "Congratulations. This was very well prepared." "Thank you. I had a long time to prepare it. I want to tell you about Josephine properly because she is the part of this story that didn't have a statute attached to it. She had known from that lunch in the second year that something was being built. She had not asked too many questions about it, which was the particular gift she gave me. Instead, at various points across the years, she had said things that were useful without being offered as strategy. "I know a notary you can use for personal documents who has no connection to your husband's professional network. I know a woman who handles the financial end of separations with a particular degree of discretion. I know how to timestamp a document in a way that stands up to later scrutiny." None of these were offered as advice. They were offered as information. The distinction mattered. Josephine understood that the difference between helping a person and doing a thing for them is the difference between their having done it and merely having had it done, and that what I was building needed to have been done by me. The evening after the determination letter came, we had dinner at the restaurant with the good bread. She asked how I felt. "Fine," I said. "Better than I expected to feel." "What did you expect it to feel like?" I thought about it honestly. "Like winning something?" I said. "It doesn't quite." "What does it feel like?" "Like the math finally matching what I knew." She looked at me for a moment. "That," she said, "is the only kind of winning that actually holds." I told her most of it that night. Not the rebirth that I kept for myself, because it is the kind of knowledge that changes how people look at you, even when they love you. And I had no interest in being looked at differently by Josephine. But I told her how the plan had started, what I had understood in those earliest months, the logic of building the record before there was any formal reason to need it. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she said, "You gave him every opportunity to be honest with you." "I gave him every opportunity to produce a written record of being dishonest with me," I said. "Those are different things." She considered this for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose they are. I filed for divorce that autumn. The separation period had completed, the paperwork was clean, my financial position was coherent enough that the asset division was straightforward. Adrian did not contest the terms in any serious way. I think by then he understood that there was very little to contest. I took my share of the jointly titled assets, the ones that were clean, and I walked away from the rest without argument or ceremony. Although I was not interested in fighting for things that had Adrian's fingerprints on them, I was interested in leaving with what I could use. The settlement was signed in a conference room on a cold November morning. The room smelled of printer toner and someone's coffee from earlier. Adrian's attorney was there. Dr. Hadley was there in a supervisory capacity because we were still technically within the audit window, and she wanted to ensure that nothing in the settlement structure inadvertently complicated my tax position, which it didn't. Josephine was in the lobby. She didn't need to be there. She was there anyway. Adrian signed first. He looked tired in the way people look tired when they have been managing something large for a long time, and the managing has taken more from them than the thing itself. His face had the compressed look of a man who had been running a particular calculation for months and had now been shown the final number. I signed. I gathered my copies. I stood up. "Done?" my attorney said. "Done," I said. I walked out of the conference room. Josephine was sitting in the lobby with a book she wasn't reading. She looked up. "Done?" she said. "Done," I said. We went to lunch. I want to spend a moment on the mechanism because the mechanism is what the story is actually about. Innocent spouse relief is not a loophole. It is a protection that Congress built directly into the joint filing system because lawmakers recognized that joint filing creates a genuine structural problem. It allows one spouse to incur tax liability on behalf of both. And in marriages where financial information is asymmetric, where one spouse controls the finances and the other is excluded, the excluded spouse can end up jointly liable for fraud they had no way to know about. The relief exists because the law recognizes that signing a document and understanding its contents are not the same thing, that a signature obtained through exclusion and redirection is not the same as a signature obtained through informed consent. What makes the relief difficult to obtain in practice is the evidentiary burden. The IRS requires you to demonstrate through records, not assertions, that you had no reason to know. And most people who sign returns they didn't prepare do not document their lack of involvement at the time. They sign because they trust, and when trust turns out to have been misplaced, the absence of documentation becomes the absence of a defense. What I built, across 6 years, was a contemporaneous record of my actual situation. The emails where I asked questions and was redirected, the annual independent reviews that flagged aggressive entries and noted my genuine unfamiliarity with the relevant structures, the clean, separate financial history that demonstrated I had lived an economic life entirely distinct from Caldwell's, the handwritten notes that anchored the documentary record to my specific, contemporaneous state of knowledge. None of this required foreknowledge to build. It required understanding early what kind of situation you are in and starting immediately to document that situation in the natural course of living through it. The questions you ask in writing and the answers you receive directing you not to ask further become the record. The separate account you open quietly and fund consistently and never commingle becomes the record. The independent professional you hire to review documents you cannot fully understand and whose written assessments predate any formal investigation becomes the record. The record becomes the case. The case becomes the outcome. The outcome becomes the life you can still stand in when everything else has been adjudicated. I know this because I lived it twice. The first time, I had none of it. I had only my word against a legal structure that does not accept words without evidence. The second time, I had all of it. Marcus sent me a short note when I told him the determination had come through. He said he was glad the work had been useful. He said he would be happy to assist with future returns on an independent basis. I wrote back and thanked him, and I kept his note in the same file with the others because I had not yet broken the habit of documentation. I'm not sure I ever will. In the months after the divorce, I did something I had not done in either life, which was sit down and look at what I had actually built, not the legal file. The financial life itself. The credit union accounts had grown steadily over 6 years of consistent deposits and modest, unhurried accumulation. The Roth IRA had done the thing that Roth IRAs do when you leave them alone. grown quietly in the background, compounding without drama. The retainer client had renewed for a third consecutive year. I had raised my rates and kept the clients I wanted and let go the ones I didn't, which was something I had not allowed myself to do before because I had been maintaining an income that felt precarious, and now, inexplicably, no longer did. I was not wealthy, I was sufficient, and sufficiency, I was finding, is a different quality than abundance, and a completely different quality than the particular flavor of financial anxiety that comes from not knowing whether what you have is actually yours. What I had was mine. Every dollar traceable, every account titled in my name. Nothing commingled, nothing obscured, nothing waiting to be examined and found to be something other than what it appeared. I moved to a nicer apartment, not extravagant, just one with good light and a kitchen large enough to use properly, in a neighborhood that had a coffee shop with outdoor seating and a library branch 6 blocks away. Yeah, and I set up my studio in the second bedroom. I got a plant and kept it alive, which I mentioned because in my first life I had been unable to keep plants alive and had attributed this to some personal deficiency, when, in fact, the problem had been that I was too anxious to water things consistently. I thought about Adrian occasionally, in the casual, unweighted way you think about a place you used to live. Not with longing, not with anger, with the neutral residual familiarity of someone who had once been very close to something and was now at a comfortable distance from it. Josephine called on a Sunday morning in February, about 8 months after the divorce was final. She said, "I saw something." I said, "Tell me." She said the name of a local business publication. And she said there was an item in the litigation column, the section that tracked civil judgments and regulatory filings, that I might want to know about. I thought about it. "I don't need to know," I said. She paused. "I know you don't need to. I thought you might want to." I thought about it again. "No," I said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." I said I was sure, because I had learned something across those years about the nature of what I was actually after. It was not the outcome on Adrian's side. The outcome on his side was the IRS's business and, eventually, if it came to that, the DOJ's business. It was not mine. I had never needed him to suffer. I had needed to not suffer in his place. The winning was not the determination letter. The winning was the Tuesday morning in a gym parking lot, phone in hand, me opening an account at a credit union 12 miles from home. The winning was every question I asked in writing and every non-answer that came back, and the fact that I had understood, clearly and in advance, what those non-answers amounted to. The winning was 6 years of small, consistent, undramatic acts that added up to a position that held. The letter was just the math made official. The math had been right for years. Josephine said she was coming by that afternoon. She said to not make anything complicated. I said I wasn't going to. I went to the kitchen and opened the window because it was a warm February, one of those days that arrives in the wrong season and offers itself without apology. And the air came in carrying something green and preliminary and not quite winter anymore. And I stood at the counter with my hands flat on the cold surface and let myself feel the ordinary fact of standing in my own kitchen in my own apartment, with my own accounts and my own clients, and nothing in any drawer or filing system or cloud storage that I would not be content to have examined in detail by anyone with the authority to examine it. The plant on the windowsill needed water. I watered it. Then I started lunch. The window stayed open.